3 years of saving every penny, working double shifts at the factory, and living in a cramped apartment had finally paid off when I purchased my 15 acres of countryside heaven. The property sat just outside of town, far enough away to feel the solitude but close enough for a reasonable commute. Rolling hills, a small pond in the back, and mature oak trees that had witnessed decades of changing seasons made this land special. The modest farmhouse needed work, but it was mine, bought and paid for with sweat and determination. The first 6 months were perfect. I spent weekends clearing brush, repairing fences, and planning where to plant my first vegetable garden. The property had natural boundaries on 3 sides, a creek to the north, a line of dense trees to the east, and the county road to the south. On the western edge, my land extended about 50 yards past a simple dirt road that cut diagonally across the corner of my property. The previous owner had mentioned that occasionally neighbors would use that dirt path as a shortcut to the main road, but assured me it happened rarely. He had never bothered to block it off, seeing no harm in the occasional passing vehicle. The worn tire tracks looked innocent enough, and for the first few months of ownership, I barely noticed any traffic. That changed on a Tuesday morning in early April. I was enjoying coffee on my front porch, the spring air crisp and full of promise, when the distinctive rumble of an engine drew my attention. A white luxury SUV appeared, driving fast enough to kick up a substantial cloud of dust as it crossed my property. The driver, a woman with highlighted blonde hair and large sunglasses, never slowed or acknowledged that she was cutting across private land. I watched, coffee cup suspended halfway to my mouth, as she disappeared down the road. Something about her casual entitlement bothered me, but I dismissed it as a one-time occurrence. Perhaps she was lost or taking a detour due to road construction somewhere. The next morning, the same white SUV appeared again, same time, same speed, same disregard. Then again that evening. By the end of the week, I realized this was a regular route for her, not a temporary deviation. Twice daily, like clockwork, the SUV would barrel across my land, the driver never once looking toward the farmhouse or slowing her pace. I began to track the times, 7:45 a.m. and 5:30 p.m. weekdays. It was clearly a commuting shortcut, but who was this woman, and why did she feel entitled to use my property as her personal thoroughfare? One evening, I decided to time the difference between her route and the proper county roads. I drove both ways myself and discovered her shortcut saved approximately 4 minutes each direction. 4 minutes twice a day at the expense of trespassing on private property. The weekend brought no SUV sightings, but Monday morning restored the pattern. This time I noticed something else. The woman was talking on her phone as she drove, gesturing animatedly with one hand while steering with the other. The casual disregard for both safety and property rights intensified my growing irritation. That night I stood near the dirt path as dusk settled over the land. Tire tracks had become more pronounced in recent days, cutting into the soil. Birds called their evening songs from the trees, and crickets began their nightly chorus. This peaceful place, my hard-earned sanctuary, was being violated twice daily by a stranger who could not be bothered to drive an extra 4 minutes on public roads. I did not yet know who she was, but I knew this could not continue. My rural peace had been disturbed, and something would have to change. Curiosity about my regular trespasser led me to ask my nearest neighbor, old Jim, who lived a quarter-mile down the county road. We stood by his mailbox as I described the white SUV and its driver. "Sounds like you have met Deborah Williams," he said, leaning on his fence post. "Everyone around here calls her Karen behind her back. She runs the Whispering Pines HOA with an iron fist." Whispering Pines was a new development of luxury homes about 2 miles away. I had driven past their ornate stone entrance several times, but had no connection to the community. "That road cutting through your land saves her from having to go all the way around to the highway," Jim continued. "Been causing trouble for years, that one. Fined the Petersons for having their garbage cans out 5 minutes too long. Made the Johnsons tear down a perfectly good treehouse because it was 6 inches taller than regulations allowed." I thanked Jim and returned home, immediately pulling out the property documents I had received during closing. That evening, I spread yellowed survey maps across my kitchen table, tracing boundary lines with my finger until I confirmed what I already suspected. The dirt road cut clearly across my property. There was no easement, no right-of-way, no legal permission for anyone to use it as a thoroughfare. Over the next week, I documented each time Karen drove across my land. Morning and evening, like clockwork, the white SUV would appear. I noticed other vehicles occasionally following the same path, a red pickup truck, a blue sedan, another SUV. The shortcut was becoming more popular. On Thursday evening, I positioned myself near the dirt road and raised my hand for Karen to stop as her SUV approached. She slowed reluctantly, lowering her window just enough to communicate. Expensive perfume wafted from the vehicle. "Can I help you?" she asked, sunglasses perched on her nose despite the fading daylight. "Yes, I wanted to introduce myself. I am the owner of this property," I said, keeping my tone friendly. "I noticed you cross through here quite regularly." She barely lowered her sunglasses, looking at me over the rims. "This road has always been here. Everyone uses it." "Actually, according to my property documents, this is private land. There is no public easement here." Karen let out a short laugh. "Look, this has been a community access route for years, long before you showed up. Whispering Pines residents have always used this road." "But it is my property," I insisted, still maintaining a civil tone. "I am not comfortable with people driving through without permission." She pushed her sunglasses back up her nose with one manicured finger. "The HOA considers this a necessary access point for our community. If you have concerns, you can bring them to our monthly meeting. First Tuesday, 7 p.m. Her window was already closing as she finished speaking. Before I could respond, she accelerated away, leaving me standing in a cloud of dust. The encounter left me stunned by her dismissive attitude and baseless claims. I watched her SUV disappear down the road, my face flushed with a mixture of disbelief and growing determination. That night, I researched Whispering Pines online. Their HOA website featured a prominent photo of Deborah Williams, identified as president of the board for 6 consecutive years. The site boasted about their exclusive community standards and vigilant property value protection. I found meeting minutes mentioning road access issues, but nothing specifically about cutting through private property. One thing became increasingly clear: Karen was not just any trespasser. She was an entitled HOA president who believed her position granted special privileges, including the right to cross my land at will. This was no longer about a simple shortcut. This was about power, entitlement, and a fundamental disrespect for property rights. The battle lines had been drawn, though I still hoped for a reasonable resolution. The next morning, I drove to the county record's office. The clerk, a woman with gray hair and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck, helped me pull property records dating back 50 years. We found no mention of an easement, public access, or right-of-way on any part of my land. "If there is no recorded easement, then legally no one has the right to cross your property without permission," she explained, sliding a booklet about property rights across the counter, "even if they have been doing it for years." Armed with this knowledge and copies of the property records, I drafted a polite but firm email to the Whispering Pines HOA board. I explained the situation, included references to the relevant property laws, and requested that they direct residents to use public roads rather than cutting across my land. 2 days passed with no response. I followed up with a phone call to the HOA office, where a receptionist promised someone would get back to me. Another 3 days, still nothing. My twice-daily visitor continued her routine, now pointedly avoiding eye contact when passing. The following Tuesday evening, I attended the HOA meeting. The community clubhouse was an impressive building with a stone facade and imposing columns. Inside, about 30 residents sat in neat rows facing a long table where 5 board members sat, Karen at the center with a small wooden gavel before her. I signed up to speak during the public comments portion of the meeting. When my name was called, I approached the podium and calmly explained the situation regarding the dirt road crossing my property. Before I could finish my third sentence, Karen interrupted. We are well aware of your concerns, but this is a historical access route that has been used by residents for over a decade, she said, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone used to silencing opposition. The time for public comments is limited. Do you have anything new to add? Yes, I have confirmation from county records that there is no easement. The gavel struck with surprising force. Thank you for your comments. Next speaker, please. I stood there for a moment, stunned by the dismissal, before returning to my seat. The meeting continued, as if my concerns were of no consequence. Afterward, I attempted to speak with other board members, but they quickly dispersed, suddenly busy with urgent matters elsewhere. 3 days later, an official-looking envelope arrived in my mailbox. Inside was a letter on Whispering Pines HOA stationery, stating that the dirt road had been continuously used as a community access route for more than 10 years, potentially establishing a prescriptive easement under state law. The letter concluded with a thinly veiled threat of legal action should I obstruct community access. I researched prescriptive easements that evening and learned that while continuous use could sometimes establish such rights, there were specific requirements that had not been met in this case. Still hoping to resolve the matter reasonably, I sent a certified letter to the HOA board outlining the legal requirements for easements and once again requesting that they respect my property rights. Their response came not in writing but in action. Traffic on the dirt road increased noticeably in the following weeks, where before it had been primarily Karen and a few others, now a steady stream of vehicles crossed my property throughout the day. Karen had apparently encouraged residents to use the shortcut, perhaps believing that increased traffic would strengthen any claim to a prescriptive easement. One morning I counted 12 vehicles in a single hour. Standing at my kitchen window, watching the fifth car of the morning cut across my land, I felt my expression harden from confusion to resolution. The diplomatic approach had failed completely. Rather than acknowledge my rights, the HOA had doubled down on their entitlement. That afternoon, I received a second letter from the HOA, this one detailing the legal expenses they were prepared to incur to protect community interests, and suggesting that a private property owner would find it difficult to match their resources in a prolonged legal battle. The message was clear. They expected me to back down in the face of their collective power and financial resources. They had mistaken my politeness for weakness, my attempts at reasonable discussion for uncertainty. The time for diplomatic solutions had passed, worn away like the dirt path they refused to stop using. April gave way to May, bringing with it heavy spring rains that transformed the innocent dirt path into a rutted, muddy scar cutting across my property. Each passing vehicle now left deeper tracks in the softened earth, water pooling in the depressions, and running off in muddy rivulets that carved new channels through my land. I had started a vegetable garden near the southern edge of my property, and the increased traffic was affecting even this simple pleasure. Exhaust fumes drifted across the tender seedlings, and dust on drier days settled on the leaves, blocking sunlight. Plants closest to the road were stunted compared to their counterparts farther away. The final Wednesday of May brought a torrential downpour that lasted through the night and into the morning. I stood at my window watching the rain create small streams across my property, turning the dirt road into a ribbon of mud. Surely no one would attempt to drive through today, I thought. Surely they would take the paved road like sensible people. I was wrong. At precisely 7:45 a.m., the white SUV appeared, moving slower than usual but still determined to take the shortcut. I watched in disbelief as Karen drove through the deepest section of mud, her expensive vehicle fishtailing slightly before regaining traction. The wheels threw mud in high arcs, spraying across my newly planted berry bushes and splashing the fence where my small flock of chickens huddled under shelter. The chickens scattered in panic, some breaking free of their enclosure in their fright. By the time I rushed outside, 3 had escaped into the woods, and the berry bushes stood coated in thick mud, some younger plants broken from the impact. Furious, I spent the next hour retrieving frightened chickens from the underbrush while rain continued to fall. That evening, despite the continuing rain, Karen appeared again. This time, her SUV left even deeper ruts, the standing water in the makeshift road now reaching halfway up her tires. More mud sprayed across my property as she passed. The destruction was no longer merely about principal or property rights. It had become tangible, measurable damage. The road had widened as drivers sought firmer ground, encroaching farther onto my usable land. Vegetation along both sides was dying from the combination of exhaust, compacted soil, and now mud contamination. With hands still dirty from attempting to salvage mud-spattered plants, I drafted a final communication. This certified letter clearly outlined the property boundaries, included photographs documenting the damage, and formally requested all trespassing to cease immediately. I stated plainly that after 7 days, I would take legal measures to protect my property. 2 days later, Karen appeared not on the dirt road but in my driveway, her SUV screeching to a halt near my front porch. She emerged wearing an expensive raincoat, leather boots unsuitable for the muddy conditions, and the ever-present sunglasses despite the overcast sky. I met her on the porch, determined to remain calm despite her dramatic entrance. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, waving my certified letter. "You cannot threaten Whispering Pines residents." "I am not threatening anyone," I replied. "I am stating my legal rights as a property owner. That road has been used by our community for years. You cannot just decide to close it." "Actually, I can. It is my property and there is no easement." Karen stepped closer, her voice rising. "Do you have any idea who you are dealing with? Our HOA has a legal fund specifically for situations like this." "The law is clear about property rights," I said. "I have documentation from the county." "Documentation?" she laughed sharply. "We have 36 homeowners who will testify about historical use. We have photographs going back years. We have resources you cannot imagine." Her finger jabbed toward my chest as she continued, "If you block that road, we will sue you for interfering with established community access. We will bury you in legal fees and take this whole place by the time we are done. Is that really what you want?" Before I could answer, she turned and walked back to her SUV, calling over her shoulder, "Be smart about this. Some battles are not worth fighting." I watched her vehicle speed away, mud spraying from her tires as a final insult. Standing among my damaged property, I felt something shift inside me. The line had been crossed. I had tried reason. I had tried diplomacy. I had tried formal communication. Each attempt had been met with escalation, threats, and damage to my property. Rain dripped from the edge of the porch roof as I looked out over my land. The dirt road was now a muddy wound stretching across what should have been a peaceful corner of my property. Karen and her HOA had made their position clear. They believed their convenience outweighed my rights, and they would use collective resources to bully me into submission. That evening, I made a decision. If legal channels and reasonable requests would not resolve this situation, then perhaps more direct action was required. Sometimes, protecting what is yours means taking a stand, regardless of the consequences. The next morning, I called a property attorney in town. The receptionist scheduled a consultation for that afternoon, and at 2 o'clock, I found myself sitting across from Mark Daniels, a lawyer with gray temples and reading glasses perched on his nose. I explained the situation in detail, showing him photographs of the damage, copies of my property documents, and the threatening letters from the HOA. He listened attentively, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. "From a legal standpoint, your position is strong," he said when I finished. "Without a recorded easement, they have no right to cross your property. Even a prescriptive easement claim would be difficult for them to establish, particularly since you have been actively objecting to the use." "So what do you recommend?" I asked. "Send one more formal cease and desist letter, this time on my letterhead. That sometimes resolves these situations." He tapped his pen on the desk. "If that fails, we could seek an injunction, though that process takes time and can be costly." And in the meantime, they continue driving through my property. "Unfortunately, yes, the wheels of justice turn slowly." He leaned forward. "There is another option, though it requires careful execution. As the property owner, you have the right to make improvements and modifications to your land, including installing barriers at the property line, provided they comply with local ordinances. I considered this carefully. You mean I could legally block the road? Yes, with proper precautions. You would need to provide adequate notice, install clear signage about private property, and ensure any barrier is visibly marked for safety reasons. He removed his glasses. I must emphasize that any modification should not create a hazard. The goal is to assert your property rights, not to cause harm or create liability. I left the law office with renewed determination and a clearer understanding of my legal position. On the drive home, I began formulating a plan. A simple fence or gate might be easily damaged or removed. I needed something more definitive, something that would make a clear statement while remaining within legal boundaries. The idea came to me as I drove past a construction site where a backhoe was digging a drainage ditch. A trench, deep enough to prevent vehicles from crossing, but with sloped sides that would not pose a significant safety hazard. Located precisely at my property line, it would be an unmistakable boundary marker. That evening, I researched local ordinances regarding property modifications. I found nothing prohibiting a landowner from digging on their own property, provided underground utilities were properly marked beforehand. I called the Utility Location Service and scheduled them to mark any buried lines. The next day, I visited an equipment rental shop in town. The owner, a practical man with calloused hands, helped me select an appropriate backhoe for the job. "Digging a drainage ditch, you said?" he asked, reviewing the rental agreement. "Something like that," I replied, signing the forms and arranging for delivery in 3 days, after the utility lines would be marked. I spent those 3 days preparing. I purchased bright orange stakes and no trespassing signs from the hardware store. I measured and marked the exact location where the trench would cross the dirt road, precisely at my property line. I took photographs of the area from multiple angles, documenting the condition before any work began. As a final precaution, I called the sheriff department's non-emergency line to inform them of my planned property modifications. The deputy who took my call listened to my explanation about the trespassing issue and my planned solution. "As long as you are working on your own property and not creating a public hazard, that is your right," he said. "Just make sure everything is clearly marked." The backhoe was delivered late Thursday afternoon. I spent that evening reviewing the operating instructions and planning the exact dimensions of the trench. It would be 3 feet deep at the center, with sides sloping at a 45-degree angle to prevent it from being a falling hazard, wide enough to stop vehicle traffic, but not so wide as to take up excessive space. That night I sat on my porch looking out at the property. The orange stakes marking the planned trench location were barely visible in the fading light. The old tractor I had purchased along with the property sat in the barn, rarely used but well maintained. Tomorrow it might serve a purpose I had never anticipated. There was no joy in what I planned to do, only the heavy certainty that sometimes justice requires more than words on paper. Property rights are meaningless if not defended, boundaries worthless if not enforced. Tomorrow would bring confrontation, but it would also bring resolution one way or another. Dawn broke with unusual clarity, the early morning light painting the landscape in shades of possibility. I was already awake, having slept fitfully through the night. By 6 a.m., I had consumed 2 cups of strong coffee and reviewed my plan one final time. The backhoe waited outside, its yellow paint catching the morning sun. I had practiced with the controls the previous evening, familiarizing myself with the levers and pedals that would guide the mechanical arm. Though I had operated similar equipment years ago during a construction job, the refresher had been necessary. I began by installing the private property and no trespassing signs at 20-foot intervals along my boundary line. Each sign was bright red with white lettering, impossible to miss. I drove the stakes deep into the ground, ensuring they would withstand wind or tampering. At 7 a.m., I climbed into the seat of the backhoe and started the engine. The machine rumbled to life, hydraulics hissing as I tested the arm and bucket. I positioned it at the starting point of my planned trench, exactly where the dirt road crossed my property line. The first bite into the earth felt momentous. The bucket dug into the soil, lifting away dirt and rocks that had been compacted by countless tires. I worked methodically, moving from one side of the road to the other, gradually deepening the trench with each pass. The rhythm of the work became almost meditative: lower the arm, curl the bucket, lift, swing, release, return. By mid-morning, sweat dampened my shirt despite the mild spring temperature. The trench was taking shape nicely, now about 2 feet deep at its center point. I took a brief break, drinking water and surveying my progress. The disturbed earth had a raw, red quality, the subsoil exposed to sunlight perhaps for the first time in centuries. A car appeared on the county road, slowing as it passed my property. The driver, an elderly man I recognized as a Whispering Pines resident, stared at the backhoe and developing trench with undisguised surprise. He continued on without stopping, but I suspected word would spread quickly. I returned to work with renewed purpose, carefully shaping the sides of the trench to create the planned gentle slope rather than sharp drops. By noon, the trench had reached its intended depth of 3 feet at the center, deep enough to prevent any passenger vehicle from crossing, but not so deep as to be dangerous. The width extended about 8 feet, making it substantial enough to be unmistakable, but not consuming excessive land. I added reflective markers along both edges as an additional safety measure, ensuring the trench would be visible even at night. As I completed the final touches, smoothing the edges and clearing loose soil, I noticed more vehicles passing slowly on the county road. Word had clearly spread. Several drivers pulled over briefly to observe before continuing on their way. I nodded politely but did not engage, focusing instead on completing my work properly. By 2 o'clock, the trench was finished. I returned the backhoe to its parked position near my barn and took photographs documenting the completed work. The transformed boundary was striking. Where before there had been an ambiguous dirt path, now there was a clear delineation. My property, their property, and no confusion about where one ended and the other began. I went inside to clean up, washing away the dirt and sweat of honest labor. Through the kitchen window, I could see the new boundary, the freshly turned earth dark against the surrounding grass. The no trespassing signs stood like sentinels, their message unmistakable. At precisely 5:25 p.m., 5 minutes before Karen's usual evening crossing, I heard the distant sound of a vehicle approaching. I dried my hands on a kitchen towel and moved to the window. There she was, right on schedule, the white SUV appearing on the horizon, moving at her customary speed toward my property. I stepped onto the porch, towel still in hand, and watched as she approached. She showed no sign of slowing, perhaps not yet able to distinguish the trench from this distance. The SUV maintained its speed, heading directly toward the now impassable boundary. Only at the last moment did recognition flash across her face, visible even through the windshield. Brakes squealed as she attempted to stop the vehicle, but momentum carried the SUV forward. The front wheels dropped into the trench with a metallic thud that echoed across the property, the chassis coming to rest on the edge while the rear wheels remained on solid ground. The SUV rocked forward and back before settling at an awkward angle, front end down, clearly stuck. The engine revved futilely, wheels spinning in the air, unable to find traction. Karen emerged from the vehicle, designer heels immediately sinking into the loose soil beside the trench. Her face registered shock, quickly transitioning to outrage as she surveyed the situation. She reached for her phone, jabbing at the screen with manicured fingers. I set the towel aside and walked down the porch steps, moving unhurriedly toward the confrontation that had been brewing for months. The moment of inevitable collision between entitlement and consequence had arrived, and I found myself surprisingly calm as I approached the boundary I had just established. "What have you done?" Karen shouted as I approached, her free hand gesturing wildly at the trench. "Do you have any idea what you have just done?" I stopped at a respectful distance, hands in my pockets. "I have marked my property line with a drainage trench. There are signs clearly posted." "Signs? You think signs make this okay?" Her voice rose to a pitch that startled a nearby bird from its perch. "This is destruction of a community access road." "There is no community access road here," I replied calmly. "This is private property, as I have been telling you for months." Karen held up her phone. "I am calling the police, and our HOA attorney. You are going to regret this." "That is your right," I said, watching as she paced along the edge of the trench, presumably seeking better cell reception. Her expensive shoes were now caked with mud, her carefully maintained appearance disrupted by the reality of rural conditions. Within 20 minutes, a sheriff department patrol car appeared on the county road. The deputy who emerged was a middle-aged man with a practical demeanor. He surveyed the scene carefully, noting the no trespassing signs, the property markers, and the stranded SUV. Karen immediately launched into an impassioned explanation about historical access and community rights. The deputy listened patiently before turning to me. "This is your property?" he asked. "Yes, sir, here are my deed and property survey." I handed him copies of the documents. "I also have photographs documenting the ongoing trespassing and damage to my property." The deputy reviewed the papers, occasionally glancing at the trench and the SUV. "Did you call us earlier this week about property modifications?" "Yes, I did. I spoke with someone at the department about my plans to mark my boundary." Karen interrupted. "This is not about boundary marking. He deliberately trapped my vehicle." "Ma'am," the deputy said, "from what I can see, this trench is clearly on private property with proper signage posted. There appears to be no easement giving you or anyone else the right to cross this land." "But we have been using this road for years," she protested. "Without permission," I added quietly. The deputy handed the documents back to me. "This looks like a civil matter regarding property rights. I cannot force the landowner to fill in a trench on his own property. As for your vehicle," he glanced at the SUV, "you will need a tow truck to get it out." Karen's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "The nearest tow service is 30 miles away. They will charge a fortune to come out here." The deputy shrugged slightly. "That is unfortunate, but I cannot help with that." After the deputy departed, leaving Karen and me at an impasse, she tried calling several towing services. As she predicted, they quoted high prices and long wait times for the rural location. After her third call ended in frustration, I spoke up. "I have a tractor, I could pull you out." She looked at me with suspicion. "And why would you help me now?" "Because leaving your vehicle stuck there does not benefit either of us," I replied. "And because I never wanted conflict, I just wanted my property rights respected." A tense silence followed before practical considerations won out. She nodded curtly. I retrieved my old tractor from the barn and attached a sturdy chain to the rear of her SUV. Neighbors who had gathered at a respectful distance watched as I carefully extracted the vehicle from the trench, towing it backward until all four wheels were on solid ground again. Once free, Karen inspected her SUV for damage. Finding none, she turned to me with a complicated expression, part relief, part lingering anger, part dawning respect. "This is not over," she said, but the words lacked their earlier venom. "Actually, I think it is," I replied. "The boundary is clear now, no more confusion about where my property begins." 3 days later, a formal letter arrived from the Whispering Pines HOA, acknowledging my property boundaries and retracting their claims about historical access rights. They requested a meeting to discuss the possibility of a proper, legal easement with fair compensation for land use. I agreed to the meeting but kept the trench in place. Sometimes clear boundaries make for better neighbors. The dirt road remained trenched, the property lines respected, and a rural peace returned, not the innocent tranquility of before, but something stronger forged in the crucible of standing one's ground.